If you're a professional brewer, you know how frustrating it can be when you go to place a yeast order and what you're looking for is out of stock. Well, Imperial Yeast is here to help by guaranteeing that commercial orders up to 20 liters of 10, yes, 10 of their most popular strains will ship free if they're not in stock when you place your order. Some of these strains include A38 Juice for those hazy IPAs, A07 Flagship, a classic in clean American styles, L13 Global, which is said to be one of the world's most popular lager strains, A44 Kviking for your warm fermented beers, and so many more. So in addition to pitching right with the highest quality yeast on the market, they're promising that yeast will be ready when you need it, or shipping is on them. Whether you're a pro or a home brewer, if you haven't tried Imperial Yeast in your brewery, it's time to up your game. You can check out everything Imperial Yeast has to offer and place your commercial orders at imperialyeast.com. Heady Topper, Pliny the Elder, Julius, Dragon's Milk, Arrogant Bastard. It's likely some, perhaps even all of these names are familiar to you, as they are some of the most well-known beers in existence today. And that's completely on purpose. One of the main reasons breweries opt to give unique monikers to their beers is to make them easily identifiable and thus distinct from other brands. Of course, as home brewers, the intention is quite a bit different, but I have to believe there's some shared sentiment in wanting to come up with something cool to call the stuff we brew. You're listening to the Brewlosophy Podcast. I'm your host, Marshall Schott. And on this episode, I'm joined by contributor Steve Thanos to chat about our experiences naming beers, ciders, and the other stuff we make at home.
Hey, Marshall. Good to be with you talking about beer names. This is something that I really like to do. Brewers and home brewers alike always talk about the whole nuance of whether beer is science or art. This definitely falls into the artistic side of it, so I'm really stoked to talk about beer names and what you've come up with and what I've come up with over the years.
Yeah, I personally think this is a really fun topic as well, and honestly, a nice break from the more specifically brewing-related stuff that we tend to focus on. I was recently talking with my buddy from Kronwolf Brewing Company, you guys know of him, Brad Gaines, about the names they give their beers, which are pretty unique, and he told me that if it weren't for his sidekick, Spencer Andrews, their beers would most likely be referred to by such creative names as IPA number 24 or German Pils number 13. I personally love a good beer name and feel that part of the fun of brewing is coming up with what to call this stuff. I've got a ton of thoughts on this topic, as I trust you do as well, Steve. This is going to be a fun one. If you're a fan of this show and you'd like to receive a reward for your support, consider becoming a patron of Brewlosophy over at patreon.com/Brewlosophy, where you make a small pledge and receive rewards like access to unpublished contributor recipes, unique discounts at YakimaValleyHops.com, and an invitation to a monthly live Q&A session with somebody in the brewing world. Coming up later this month, April of 2022, are Kyle Brown and Emmett Leahy from Clawhammer Supply, a company that specializes in electric brewing systems as well as gear for distilling. Really nice distilling gear. On top of that, they also have a banging YouTube channel where they do all sorts of cool stuff. Definitely go check their stuff out. To be a part of this event, be sure to make your pledge at patreon.com/Brewlosophy by Saturday, April 23rd, 2022, as the guys are going to be taking questions that Sunday, the 24th. All past sessions are stored on our private Facebook page, so patrons can go back and watch them whenever they like. Again, that's patreon.com/Brewlosophy. Another really easy way to support us is by using the links found at brewlosophy.com/support when you're doing your shopping online. It is absolutely painless. You just click a link, do your shopping, and we get a little kickback for the referral. To everybody who has been doing that already, thank you so much. It is incredibly helpful, and it really does allow us to keep bringing you this content. Feedback is brought to you by Brewers Hardware, who offer brewers beautiful stainless gear such as the turnkey BH15 pilot brewing system, which has a hard plumb manifold to eliminate all hosing changes during the brew process. Brewers Hardware has a ton of unique purpose-built products useful to both professionals and homebrewers. Go see for yourself at brewershardware.com, and don't forget to mention Brewlosophy at checkout to receive a free gift. That's brewershardware.com. Jordan Hoffmeyer had some feedback on our recent episode where we talked about our views on low and no alcohol beers. Jordan says, I don't know if any of you are boaters, but you may or may not be aware of the drinking culture that sometimes surrounds pleasure boating. Think pontoons and coolers. I'm pretty sure drinking and driving a boat is illegal in every state, but for some reason it seems to be socially acceptable to drink and boat, or more socially acceptable than it is to get behind the wheel of a car. Don't get me wrong, if I'm on a boat in the heat of summer, I'm going to want want beer. Enter non-alcoholic beer. My wife is a boating education coordinator, and I'm pretty sure that Athletic Brewing is a sponsor at the conference she's attending this week. They probably see NA beer and boating as a good market, but also an opportunity to affect some positive change.
Yeah, I like the idea. It kind of reminds me of a time when I was visiting a friend down at Illinois State, and I jumped in my car after going to the store, and I cracked open a bottle of craft root beer, and there was some police down the road a little bit, and they must have saw me opening it up. And sure enough, I was stopped, and I reassured them that with the receipt and the bottle itself, like, this is root beer, it's not beer. But I can understand from a distance and kind of what it looked like. And it would definitely give boaters kind of another choice to enjoy some beer without the effects of alcohol.
Yeah, absolutely. That is a funny story, Steve. I've never been pulled over. I've never gotten a DUI, and I'm proud of that. I tend to be kind of a neurotic when it comes to being safe behind the wheel, and when it comes to drinking, I try to be as responsible as possible. I may make a fool of myself, but I'm not going to hurt anybody, basically. So I've been pulled over many times for stupid stuff. None for having an open soda bottle, in my car. That's so funny. We do have checkpoints where I'm from. They'll do these random checkpoints and try to catch people, driving drunk and stuff. And I've stopped at a few of those successfully, making it through. But I did grow up near lakes, and I've spent a lot of time in boats. In fact, I owned my own boat for a while as well. And Jordan, you're not wrong, man. There's definitely a drinking culture that surrounds the boating life. I can't tell you how many times, and this is no joke, and it shocks me every time, I've seen people partying out in the middle of the lake and wondered how the hell the driver, who's just crushing beers, usually Tecate or something, how they're going to get back to the shore safely, right? I mean, obviously people are making it back to shore safely, but my goodness. And for those who associate good times with beer, I love that these non-alcoholic options are available. But like I said in that episode that Jordan is referencing, I've never had an issue just drinking water. Like I don't have that weird drive to want beer in specific situations. But these NA beers that I've had don't really taste like beer anyways. So I'm not, it sounds like I'm like deriding these non-alcoholic beers. I love that they're there. I really do. And I like even more that people are enjoying them. It's just not my, no pun intended. It's just not my boat. I don't really feel like going out and buying NA beers just to say that I can drink beer while I'm riding a boat or driving a car or whatever it is. And so I'm not into it, but I'm really glad that you like them, Jordan, and that there's other people out there who will defer to non-alcoholic or very low alcohol beers over beers that are going to give them a buzz when they're in situations that could become a bit sticky. So thank you so much for the feedback, Jordan. If you have show feedback, you can send it to feedback@brewlosophy.com or drop us a note on social media. All right, time for a quick break. When we return, we'll be discussing our experiences naming the stuff we brew. Craftmaster Growlers takes traveling with and sharing beer to a new level. Made from heavy-duty stainless steel, Craftmaster Growlers are double-wall insulated and can keep beer cold for up to 8 hours. Unlike typical growlers, Craftmaster Growlers come with a swiveling tap and fully integrated CO2 regulator cap, allowing beer to stay fresh for 2 weeks or more. The square design takes up less space and will fit in most refrigerator doors, and every Craftmaster Growler comes with a 1-year warranty. There are 64 and 128-ounce versions available over at craftmastergrowlers.com. After a long brew day, the last thing I want to do is waste more time chilling wort. I've tried so many different options, and ultimately I settled on the super efficient immersion chillers made by Jaded Brewing. With the King Cobra and Hydra, I'm able to chill my entire batch of wort from boiling to just a few degrees above groundwater temperature in as little as 6 minutes. If an immersion chiller is right for your brewery, then do yourself a favor and check out all of the rad options Jaded Brewing has to offer at jadedbrewing.com. And be sure to let them know Brewlosophy sent you.
Looking for a new career? Welcome to Do HVAC Training Service Center in North Charleston. Enroll today in our comprehensive HVAC training hands-on field experience-based program, covering troubleshooting, maintenance, installation, and more on various HVAC systems and ductwork. We offer EPA and NAEP preparation and testing, along with various certifications. Enjoy payment options. Achieve certification in under 5 months. Enroll now for your new journey of skill development and career advancement. Log on to dewhvactrainingsc.com to inquire.
I started playing the guitar when I was in junior high, and after 3 or 4 years of jamming to songs other people wrote, I began writing my own and eventually joined a band. Now, more often than not, when we'd come up with a new song, the final piece was giving it a name. Very rarely did we go into writing a song with a name already picked out. So in doing so, we were forced to consider a number of things. Particularly, did we want the name to be a direct reflection of the song's meaning? Were we looking for literal, or we were going to go for something a little bit more vague? This has definitely been my experience when it comes to naming beers and ciders and the other stuff that I make at home. And seeing as I've brewed far more batches than songs I wrote, you're welcome for that. My process for coming up with names has definitely evolved over the years. Steve, I was thinking it might be fun to start off by talking about our thoughts on naming beers and such in general. I mean, I know there are some people out there who view it as moot, at least for home brewers, but that is not the case for us.
No, and I get that. I get the idea that people don't really care much about naming their beers. It could be like your friend Brad, who just names it Pale Ale 1 or IPA 3. I get that, and there's a certain that's a bit funny to me even, and I would even entertain that idea, just kind of as a joke. But yeah, there's definitely the artistic side in my brain that craves that ability to use that. Ability to name a beer something, whether it be really intentional and literal, or something very vague and has nothing to do with the beer itself.
See, and that's where I have this weird thing, and I wasn't sure if I was going to tell this story because it's going to make me look really awkward, I'm sure, but I've got 3 kids. I talk about them often. They're the loves of my life, along with my wife, and with each one, when it came to naming our kids, right, and I am not trying to make the association that, the beers I make are like my children. I'm not one of those people, but when it comes to naming things, I have this neurotic desire, this need it needs to be meaningful. It has to have some connection. And for me, in doing that, it allows me to feel connected to this thing. And that sounds so cheesy. I know that. But each of my kids, Hazel, Roscoe, and Olive, all have a reason for being the name that they got, right? Hazel is the color of my wife's eyes. Roscoe is the name of a song that was really impactful to my wife and I when we were younger. And then Olive is the same color as Hazel, in essence. And so we thought that was really cool.
That's cool.
Even though that meaning is, it's kind of faint. It's nothing huge. They're not family names or anything like that. That meaning makes me feel kind of connected to these names, which we know. I mean, if we want to get into the Tao and stuff like that, the name is not the person, but the name is not the beer either. But it still gives us something cool to look at and to think about. And for me, that's one of the main reasons I like naming beers, is that it's not that I'm trying to pretend like I'm a professional. I know I hear people say that all the time. Well, you're not going to sell your beer anyways. That's not it. It's just another part of the process that I think is kind of fun.
To me, it's as important as picking what hops I want to use or what yeast do I want to use. It's all a part of the process, I think.
And that's a good way to put it too, because there are times, and I've never actually thought about it as a part of the entire process. To me, it's kind of the period at the end of the sentence of a recipe, right? It's like, okay, I've done this beer, and we're going to talk about here in a sec. There are times when we don't really give a beer a name, and I definitely have those. But for me, it's like the thing that I do once I've settled on this recipe. Maybe I've brewed it multiple times, or maybe I got lucky and this first batch is what I'm going to stick with, and I might drift a little bit in the recipe over time and keep that name. But for me, that the name is something that has again, I know this sounds really weird, but it has some sort of a connection to what I did in brewing that beer, to what that beer represents for me, perhaps to the ingredients that were used, something like that. And it just, there's something fulfilling about that to me. It's like once I've given this name, I've like wrapped the gift of this recipe for myself, and it's all done. It's the bow on the top.
Yes. It makes sense. It totally makes sense. I think that like I said, the name is as important as the ingredients that I'm using. And sometimes, it does kind of, I have difficulty with the name, and I will have to struggle a little bit with it. And I kind of associate that with almost like writer's block, right?
Yeah.
Where you need distance from it. Go for a walk, or go grab a beer or whatever, and not think about it for a while, and then come back to it. And 9 times out of 10, I can come up with something that is somewhat workable. In terms of having experiences while I'm brewing, I guess I don't really gravitate towards that all that much, but I can see how I could, and maybe like getting stung by a yellow jacket while lifting the kettle off the burner would be something that I could think about. That was many years ago with battling yellow jackets in the middle of August, brewing a pumpkin beer. But I already had a name for it, so the yellow jackets didn't become synonymous with my beer, but just with the story about brewing the beer.
You know how many brewers likely have stinging insect
for sure.
influence? I have a friend, Olin Sudduth. He I don't know what he's doing with Brew United anymore these days, but he had a beer that he was out brewing, and his kid was out brewing with him, and I think like 2 or 3 bees got into the wort towards the end of the boil and died. And so obviously that beer name was inspired by the fact that he had killed these bees on accident, in the making of the beer. But that happens often because of the fact that wort is so sweet, and it's going to attract bees and wasps and yellow jackets and such.
For sure, it's the one thing that we have to look out for when we're brewing.
The most dangerous thing, that and boiling wort, of course. Yeah.
Yes.
Now one of the things that I'll do, I have this weird thing, and when I used to write, I still write songs on the side, and just for fun, it's kind of my outlet. People need that stress relief, and that's what I do with the guitar and singing and such. And I feel kind of the same. It's a similar sentiment that I used to have when I was in this band, and we were actually writing songs and trying to put our heads together. Is I don't want to waste a good name, and so. There are times anybody who writes songs has experienced this thing where you're like, why am I stuck on this specific topic? I'll have 2 or 3 different songs that sound completely different, but without me even trying, they all kind of come back. They converge at this one thing that just seems to be on my mind lately. So I'll do this thing where I'm like, well, I don't want to waste the good name on the song that may not be as good as the other one, or whatever it is. And so I feel like there's this part of me that in speaking about times when I don't name beers, if I'm trying out a new recipe, if let's say I'm trying to work on a new style or something like that, something I haven't brewed in a long time, but I want to nail down kind of like my recipe for this style, I'll start by calling, and I do the same thing Brad does. It'll be like a Belgian Quad 1. Belgian Quad 2. And then as I start to get to this thing that I want, that's when I'll start relying on what did I do in the making of this beer? Or like what environmental stuff may not have anything to do with the actual beer or recipe, but like what was going on at the time of my brewing this, that will this name is going to be some memory. And we're going to talk about some of our fun beer names that we've had over the years, which you and I have many. We're going to talk about some of our favorite ones in the next segment and how we came to those. But for me, it doesn't just have to be about the beer. It kind of has to be about the experience. I want every time I say that name for it to be kind of this memory. And for people who don't care about stuff like that, I totally get why they wouldn't want to name their beers, because it doesn't even cross their mind for it to be something meaningful. It's just a beer. Why are you calling it something?
Exactly.
It's because it gives me something to refer to it as. And I'm sure you can relate with this, Steve, as somebody who is very involved in your homebrew club and in the, as a part of Brewlosophy, you are naturally going to be involved in the brewing scene in general, that when we are able to talk about beers we've brewed and they have a name, not only does it make it easier, but it's cool that our friends will come and ask, hey, have you tried, when was the last time you brewed such and such recipe? And you're like, whoa, that's cool that they know, that's a beer that I created, a recipe that I created.
I think over time, any home brewer will have this sort of connection with their beer. And I know it sounds really weird and geeky and almost trivial. But I mean, this is a hobby that we all love. So yeah, we can get geeky here. But yeah, it's a cool thing when, a friend will say, hey, when's the last time you brewed Den of Iniquity, which I'll talk about in a second. And I'm like, oh, you know what? I really love that beer. I got to brew that soon. Or my wife's sister was just in town with our niece. And we spent some time with them. We were talking about the summer trip that we're taking to Ohio this week or this summer. And I'm trying to, we're renting a house, going to be by the lake. I'm like, I think it's time to brew some Den of Iniquity. So it's a beer that I'm used to, my wife likes, my wife's family likes, so it needs a name, it needs a reference point, right? It's something that I try to make as my house IPA, and as I'm going through the process of really trying to nail down this recipe, I always referred to it as Den of Iniquity. It was a name that my wife and I kind of thought of one night just watching TV, and it kind of stuck. However, I will say in all the trials that I've gone through with this beer, it has Mosaic hops in it, which is one of my favorite hops, along with Amarillo. However, if this beer had something like Sabro in it, it would be a totally different beer name.
Yeah.
And that's how geeky I am. That's how much down the rabbit hole I go, because to me, the ingredients matter and the name matters. So why not, utilize that list of about 30 or 40 beer names that are in my notes app on my phone.
So do you write down, like, you come up with a beer name and you're like, oh, that'll be great, and you'll write it down, and then you'll use one of those beer names
constantly. If I'm teaching, I teach 7th grade reading. If I'm teaching one day and I think of it, when I get a free second, I'll jot it down on a Post-it note and stuff it in my pocket, and and later on come to it and go to my notes app and write it down, or type it out rather. And yeah, everything's right there. Everything is saved. I actually know pro brewer friends who are like that too. It's just a way to save it and a way to make sure you don't lose it, because as I'm getting older, I'm forgetting things. And
welcome to the club, dude.
Yes, definitely.
So it sounds to me though like you don't do the weird thing that I do, where like there has to be some string of meaning. You have these rad names, and then those are all available kind of in your pot for the rad beers that you might brew. Do you name every single beer you brew, or do you kind of do what I do, which is like, okay, I made this batch of pale ale. It's not quite where I want it to be, so I'm going to reserve the name for it until I get it where I want it to be? Or do you just kind of slap a name on it, and then any future iterations just kind of the name sticks? Or
I always name my beers without a doubt. Every beer needs to have a name, but I do share your sentiment about at first, if I don't think of a name, I'll call it pale ale, whatever, and then I come back to it. And that's the beautiful part about editing, right? You just go back to fix what you want it to be. But yeah, every beer needs to have a name, in my opinion. And if it doesn't, I'll think of it, and I'll go back to my notes like I have, and as a sort of a savior, and I can dive into that a little bit and look around. So usually 9 times out of 10, I'm coming up with something.
That's cool. I like that. And it's have you ever felt like you gave a beer a name, and then that it was, you were calling it that for so long, and then you stopped liking that recipe, and you're like, well, great, I just wasted a good name.
Yeah, I do actually. If it's I'm as an English teacher, as a reading teacher, I like words, and I tend to get stuck on certain words. Sometimes with names, and especially it's usually the one word names, which we'll talk about later. And yeah, I do feel at times like, oh, I really wasted it, and I'm really kind of bummed that I'm not brewing that beer much anymore. But then again, it might actually motivate me to brew that beer. Yeah. And, I can always take the liberties of, I don't have to worry about selling it, right? So I can always just take the liberties of, well, now Inception, which is something I just thought off the top of my head, now has, Sabro and Amarillo hops instead of just Mosaic. I'll take that creative liberty with it.
Yeah. Well, and another fun thing that I'll like to do is if I take a specific recipe, and I think a lot of brewers do this just in terms of messing around or experimenting with new ingredients, you take a tried and true recipe that you've come up with and you've brewed 1,000,000 times, and you tweak, maybe it's just the hop schedule, and you add different hop varieties or something like that. One of the things that I like doing, if I have a name for that, let's just go with Inception, because you said that. I don't have a beer name Inception. I might come up with like a play on Inception. So it might be, I might go to the thesaurus even and look at like what's a different term that might be used for Inception, so that there's still a link. And it's, again, there's this weird part of me where it's like, when I do it that way, I feel like the puzzle is complete.
Yes.
This sounds so stupid, but I have an excuse, for why I landed on that name.
For sure. If anything, if anybody can relate to this, and I'm hopefully that people can relate to this whole idea of naming beers. Like for a number of years before we started talking about doing this podcast, I always thought I was the one who was the odd one out, but obviously I'm not, because at least you're sharing my sentiments with me, Marshall. So
it's just the two of us, Steve.
Yeah, probably.
No, there are I hear from a lot of brewers, hundreds of brewers every week. I can't even keep up with my emails these days. And I'm telling you, they'll send me, recipes that they've got. They'll send me their Brewfather link or whatever. And I go there and they all have names. I mean, more people, I think the majority of home brewers out there who, and I know that this applies to brewers, professional and home, but I think a majority of home brewers who aren't marketing their beer, who aren't selling it, who aren't putting it on Untapped or whatever, I think a majority really get some value out of naming their beers. It's just fun. And there's a part of naming stuff. When you get a dog, you're like, you're considering, what are we going to call this dog? Is it going to be a cool name? Is it going to be a cute name? What is it going to apply to the way they look? Are they going to be called Spot because they have spots or whatever it might be? There's a part of it that just feels fulfilling. And it sounds like such an odd thing, because really it's so, like you mentioned earlier, it's just kind of this trivial aspect of the process of making beer, but it doesn't matter. We find meaning in the trivial, and I think that naming beers is one of the. So when we've kind of hit on some of this stuff already, but I want to talk about things that we like and don't like about beer names in general. I know you've got some pretty strong opinions about approaches some people take to naming their beers and ciders and such, and I probably agree with you based on what we talked about earlier on the over-sexualization of beer names. We're not going to go down that rabbit hole too much. I think that could get a bit more opinionated, but in general, I think we both agree that it's just that if you're going to share it publicly, it's probably not even going to be as funny as you think it's going to be.
Well, I just take the approach that it's just lazy and uncreative, if I can use that word. Non-creative, whatever you want to say. It's just, and I won't, like you said, I won't get too far down this rabbit hole, because it's probably something that we can spend a lot of time talking about, I'm sure. But yeah, like there are some breweries that name their beers certain things, and it's like, yeah, okay, haha, and then it's like, it's just lazy. It's not creative, and if that's your thing, that's your thing. More power to you. But for me personally, I like words. I like language. I like pop culture. I like different things that are going on around us that influence me in my beer making. So therefore, I'm going to use those things as more of a creative outlet. And calling, a beer name something overly sexualized just doesn't do it for me.
Yeah, I'm in the same boat. For me, it's just boring. It's so obvious. It's the kind of like that bro thing, and I get that people think that, kind of like when we were 12, you hear the word, certain words, we'll just put it that way, body parts, and you laugh and you think it's so funny, and
right.
You kind of grow out of that within like 4 or 5 years, but some people don't, and you're not. I mean, the thing is, Steve and I, you and I, given the color of our skin and the stuff between our legs, we'll put it, are pretty privileged. We don't have to feel offended. And so my wife will point out often how things just go over my head. It is impossible to offend me. You can call me names. I think you're just being funny. You can criticize me. I honestly think you're just trying to help me out. It doesn't offend me. And so it can be difficult for people in our position to see that. But I just think if you're going to go public with stuff, keep the what is sadly become political, but keep that stuff out of it unless it is genuinely a joke and it's not. Sure. And you're not I guess kind of calling out specific groups of people in a derogatory way.
And if everybody's privy to that joke as well. So that's
what I mean. Exactly.
Yeah, it's not just, the inside bro joke that everyone gets, within your circle. And yeah, I mean, I look at it as, beer, of course, is something that's important to me and it's big in my world. So I'm drinking at home, and you have daughters, I have a child at home, and if I'm going to say to my wife or a guest in our house, say, hey, do you want to try this new beer? And they all know that I like naming my beers. What'd you call it? And if it's something that's offensive or just off-putting, do I really want my kid to hear that? Now, granted, they're 11 years old, and it's... my child's got to hear this language, but yeah. I don't need to glorify it in a sense that it becomes, common language or common knowledge, for lack of a better term, in my house. So
yeah, and I think that makes so much sense. There are times, however, where like I was trying to think of instances where I guess it's kind of a fuzzy area, kind of a gray area for me on a personal level. I brewed a beer about 6 years ago for my aunt who lives in town here, and she is very tall. She played basketball in high school, very skinny, and I asked her what she wanted. We were going to a party at their place. I said, what kind of beer do you want me to bring? She loves really light, pale types of beers that don't have much hops. So whether that's a lager or a blonde ale or whatever, at the time, 805 from Firestone Walker was huge. And so I told her I'd make like a low alcohol version of 805 for her. What do you want to call it? And she said, call it Tall Skinny Blonde, because it's a blonde ale. And I guess that's not overly sexualized, but it's not something that I would put out there publicly. I'm not going to, because I feel like it gets too close. And in the world we live in, sadly, everything gets overly looked at these days. And you got to just be careful for your own sake, because you may not even mean something and it comes across the wrong way. And so I feel like if you're going to go public with something, obviously as homebrewers, we're already doing it, Steve. We're already going down this rabbit hole. Yeah, we are. And so we'll pull back a little bit. But I do think I agree with you that when it comes to our experience naming beers, we can tend to shy away from the more risque. We'll just put it that way.
For sure.
Now, what do you think? I got called out a few years ago for every beer that I was putting on Brewlosophy, and just a little insider trading stuff here. Those oftentimes the guys will submit their stuff to me for editing, and there's no beer names attached to it. Now, Steve, you are clearly one who doesn't do that. You always have a beer name.
Correct.
But some of the guys just expect me to come up with names, and so I've gone through this interesting up and down of different ways to approach naming these beers that the other guys brew, just because we have to have a name on the website. So suffice to say, I've probably come up with over 1,000 beer names in the last 15 years that I've been brewing. There was somebody who called me out. It was on Facebook, and it was somebody who's relatively well known in the beer world, who said, why does every one of your beers, why is it alliterative? Why does it, a brown ale have a name that starts with a B, or a pale ale has a name that starts with a P, stuff like that. And I thought, man, I didn't even realize I was doing that.
I think it's a subconscious thing that when you're trying to meet a deadline, you fall back on maybe in your world what's safe. I don't know.
Yeah. You know what, though? I was glad she pointed it out, because once she did, I was like, I am not going to do that anymore. And guess what? I still do it sometimes now because sometimes it just works. Sometimes it just sounds good.
Sure.
So
For sure.
There's another way of going about naming beers that we see quite often. For me, and this is just based purely on observation over the time I've been drinking craft beer, especially. You'll see like a brewery, for example, Sierra Nevada, who has multiple, obviously is making multiple styles, but they'll go with something like Sierra Nevada Pale Ale. That's the name of that beer. So it's the brewery name plus the style of the beer. And I've seen some homebrewers do that as well. They kind of call their home brewery something, and then everything that they make underneath that is just, name of brewery, pale ale, IPA, brown ale, red IPA, or whatever. And I think that's a pretty cool way to go about it. I think it saves you from, if you're not the very creative type, it's kind of a cool way to just stick with this name that you came up with for what you call your home brewery, and without having to go down, trying to come up with names for each beer.
Yeah, and in writing my notes for this podcast, I was thinking about that and thinking about the beers that I've brewed over the years. And in my notes, we have another topic to talk about in a little bit. And I'm like, oh, I do that because the beer that I will name later on has the beer style written in the beer name. So yeah, I guess I do it sometimes, not always. I don't think I try to make a conscious decision to do it or not do it. I just think it whatever kind of flows out of my mouth, whatever pops in my head, is what I go with.
I was brewing with a good friend of mine for a while. In fact, when I first started brewing, it was with my roommate, and then I took kind of a hiatus. I've told this story before during grad school, and as soon as I was done, I got back into it with a friend who lived near me at the time. And so there was about a 4-year period where I was just helping other people brew and not brewing on my own. I lived in a small apartment. There's a bunch of reasons why. But as soon as I bought my house and had my career, I got right back into it. And here we are today. But this person I was brewing with loved to come up with beer names. And we kind of had like a home brewery name for a while. We called ourselves Bright Spot. And there is a very long story behind where that name came from that's kind of meaningful to both of us. But suffice to say, we had a lot of fun just developing recipes and not coming up with names for those specific beers because Bright Spot sounds so good with so many different styles. We had a Bright Spot IPA, Bright Spot Brown Ale. I think we've shared a couple of my Bright Spot recipes with our patrons, in fact, and they're really solid recipes. So I've definitely played around with that approach to naming beers as well. So, well, we've got to get to a quick break. When we come back, we're going to be talking more specifically about each of our processes for coming up with beer names, as well as going over some of our personal favorites. As every brewer knows, the best beer requires the best hops, which Yakima Valley Hops provides fresh from the source to brewers around the world, carrying everything from classics like Cascade to modern favorites like Galaxy and Mosaic, as well as other ingredients and gear. Yakima Valley Hops has it all. And don't forget to check out their new podcast, The Late Edition, where the YVH crew goes into depth on our favorite plant with industry experts. Head over to YakimaValleyHops.com now to see all they have to offer and subscribe to The Late Edition wherever it is you listen to podcasts. There's no denying that stainless steel is the best material for brewing equipment, and Delta Brewing Systems offers some of the lowest prices on high-quality stainless gear, like the Firm Tank, which in addition to holding 8 gallons or 30 liters of wort, comes with a domed lid to even further reduce the chances of a messy blow-off. Plus, it can hold up to 4 psi of pressure for closed transfers. Delta Brewing Systems also has their own line of brew kettles, as well as one of the lowest-priced all-in-one electric brewing systems out there, and their prices are shockingly low. If you're in the market for legit stainless gear that won't break the bank, do yourself a favor and head over to deltabrewingsystems.com today. Chilling wort can be a chore, especially after a long brew day, but not with the exGEERitor Counterflow Chiller, which can chill a 5-gallon or 19-liter batch of wort in 5 minutes or less, leading to a strong cold break and clear wort in the fermenter. Brewlosophy's Matt Del Fiacco uses the exGEERitor Max and absolutely loves it. In addition to improved chilling efficiency, every exGEERitor comes with a 5-year warranty that covers the entire chiller for manufacturer defects. If you're looking to up your chilling game and a CFC is right for you, head over to exGEERitor.com today. I have no qualms admitting that I am not a terribly creative person. I cannot draw or paint. I far prefer documentaries to fantasy or sci-fi. I'm actually convinced this is one of the reasons I love brewing so much. It gives a less creative guy like me an outlet to come up with new stuff that's potentially really cool. And in my opinion, coming up with a name for the stuff I brew is an extension of the entire process. Well, as someone who isn't naturally creative, at least I don't view myself that way, I tend to seek inspiration for my beer names in some curious places. Is that true for you as well, Steve?
Oh, for sure. For sure. Thinking about movies, thinking about music, books that I've read, and then just overall experiences in life. It gives me a plethora of material to gloss over and to think about how that can become a name for a beer.
Yeah. And there's this element of, to me, it's almost like paying homage to the things that have shaped who I've become, in my day.
Yes.
And
for sure.
Relying on, we're using the term pop culture influences, but what we're talking about is just popular culture, the stuff, whether that's, punk rock or whatever it was that I was into when I was in seventh grade,
Right.
What we're talking about is just being influenced by those things that influenced us originally, and using that to come up with beer names. Obviously, I think one of the first places that people like us go are our favorite movies. I can't tell you how many names that people out there don't understand that have been on brewlosophy.com have been almost directly lifted from some of my favorite movies. And they're the smallest little lines that I always thought were hilarious or really meaningful or whatever it might be. I've actually come up with beer names that were influenced by titles of movies even. And they slips right under the radar. People don't even recognize most of the time what movies they're from. I have received the occasional email where people are like, I can't believe you loved the movie Rad as much as I did. That BMX movie from the 80s.
Oh, it's such a good movie.
I've used that movie probably 6-7 times for beer names.
Definitely. Definitely. Yeah. I've used a few movies here and there to name a beer. One of my first beers that I actually brewed a while back was a winter warmer. This kind of goes back to the following, the previous segment where we were talking about naming the beer style with the name itself, and then became my popular winter warmer that I loved so much, which was Clark's Winter Warmer. And Clark,
I know
of
where
course,
that's from.
paying homage to our man Clark W. Griswold from Christmas Vacation. If a beer name can ever encapsulate a movie, a time of the year, the season, it's Clark. Let's just all be honest with ourselves. Clark is the man. So
he's the man.
I try my hardest to replicate this beer every year. And it's the damnedest thing. I just can't do it. It's something with the spices, I think, in a winter warmer that are just difficult to nail since I nailed it the first time. But Clark still kind of lives within me as a great beer name.
Yeah, I love it. I was trying to think, what might I have called a big winter warmer, nice high ABV, rich malty flavored beer that I wanted to be inspired by National Lampoon's Christmas Vacation, and my brain would have gone to something like the bonus came through. Like something weird like that, right? Because he was waiting on his bonus, and there's this elusiveness to me that I think it's almost like this. I like setting people up to try to figure out the puzzle. Like, where did this come from? And people who know me know that I'm not just going to haphazardly call something, a beer, some weird name. I'm doing it because there's something underneath it.
Exactly.
And I love it.
There's layers.
Yeah, exactly. And we're kind of in this fortunate position to where it's like we share a lot of our names. I mean, you had a hilarious name for a beer that you made around Thanksgiving that we'll talk about here in a minute.
Oh, yeah.
We got a ton of feedback just on the name alone, right? People were thanking us for the reminder and and all of that stuff. And there's something about that that's a lot of fun. Another huge source of inspiration for me. I grew up, I moved to Seattle area from where I live here now in Fresno when I was 11 years old. And for those who grew up in the Seattle area in the mid 90s, there was a huge music scene there. It's still very big, but we were so fortunate. I mean, twice twice a weekend, we were going out to concerts. We'd pay $3 to $5 to see amazing bands play. One of them was this band called Sunny Day Real Estate, which I love them so much. They're still one of my favorites. But back then, they weren't even really known.
Right.
And they released their first record, and it had this song called Grendel on it. And I remember thinking, like, what the hell does Grendel mean? And I looked into it and I couldn't figure it out. And I'm sure people out there know what it means. But back then I remember just being so confused, like, where did this name come from? Or they would have names like on their, I think it was their second record, they have a song called like 3/5, which has to do with the time signature of the song,
Okay.
And you're like, wow, there's something about that I really like. It's simple and yet it speaks something. There's, and so I have a beer name that's on the website, I believe, called Grendel. That's just pays homage to Sunny Day Real Estate.
That's awesome. That's awesome. Speaking of paying homage, I pay homage to the character Jim Hopper from Stranger Things. This will actually be coming out in a couple of weeks as a experiment. I won't talk much about the experiment itself, of course, but the the beer that I was brewing has a lot to do with the fact that I mix some coffee into it, and the name Coffee in Contemplation is now born. And it's a scene in season 1 when Jim is walking out of his office and his secretary is in his ear, and it's a Monday morning and Jim is a little grumpy, maybe a little hungover, and he just says repeatedly to his secretary, I don't know, I remember her name, I'll just make up a name, Phyllis, Mondays are for coffee and contemplation. And it's such a great, first of all, kudos to the writers of Stranger Things to come up with such a way to encapsulate a Monday morning. I don't really know anything better than, sleep in. But coffee and contemplation, finally, I've hung on to this name since Stranger Things started, and it was in my notes on my phone, and I'm finally able to use it. So
yeah, that is awesome. I love it. And that one, obviously, I mean, and I see, and that's the thing is, like, this is where you could easily use a name that you want to go with to inspire the recipe that you come up, which I've done a few times.
Oh, yeah.
Obviously, Coffee and Contemplation could be a strong coffee flavored beer or something like that, and you think about stuff like that. There was one time where a buddy of mine challenged me to, I think it was what do they call it? The golden ratio, whatever that is. Mm-hmm. Fibonacci's sequence. He was like, I wonder what would happen, because this is supposed to be like the perfect number or whatever it is. He's like, I wonder what would happen if we brewed a beer that was inspired by the golden ratio, this Fibonacci's thing. And so we designed this beer with all these crazy weird, like 0.263 ounces of this. And, and the beer was fine. It was nothing special by any means. It wasn't perfect, I'll tell you that, but it was cool to have that inspiration. And we ended up calling it, something related to Fibonacci's sequence that was, kind of under the covers a little bit. And I thought that was cool. It was fun. Am I going to brew the beer again? Probably not. There's many other recipes I enjoy more, but that inspiration was there. I know people who use various things that I'm not even interested in as inspiration for naming their beers. There's a commercial brewery down in Anaheim called Unsung Brewery that I believe all of their beers are inspired by like superhero comic books.
Nice.
and stuff like that. Yeah, it's super cool.
I like that.
Yeah, I really like it. And that's another thing is like, hey, we're gonna start from this position and use that as the inspiration for everything that we do.
Right.
Whereas guys like us, Steve, again, we're home brewers, but we kind of view each beer independently and we'll name it something completely separate from something else. But there are quite a few breweries that do that. There's another brewery, I believe it's up in Northern California, who every beer is in some way has a name that's associated with the prison system, and so it'll be, there's a winery actually in town that does the same thing called Solitary Cellars. Great place right here near us. And they do the same thing with the wines they make. And there's something about that I think is pretty cool as well.
Well, I think it's a smart thing, especially the superheroes idea, because it's already out there in the world. So now that becomes their sort of kind of quasi marketing scheme, that's not scheme in a bad way, but just marking the idea that they kind of stumbled upon, that now they're the brewery that have all those cool superhero names.
Yeah.
And it's a pretty ingenious thing, I think.
Yeah, not only that, their branding is phenomenal. Like you can't miss it because it looks very comic booky.
That's awesome.
Another thing that I or approach that I know people use to name their beers, and I like this one because it serves as kind of a kind of like a bookmark in time, right? You can go back like, oh, remember this is current events, right?
Yeah.
So Ray found back when he was brewing for Brewlosophy, spent probably over a year just tweaking an amber ale recipe to his liking. And when he finally landed on the one that he loves, it was right around the 2016 election season, and he called it Make America Amber Again. And that beer to this day gets referenced in so many places. And I know that I believe it's Heretic Brewing around the same time came out with an amber ale that they call Make Amber Great Again or something,
Yep.
So kind of playing on, making light of logos or slogans and stuff like that, I think is such a fun way to name beers as well. And also, again, kind of serve as those reminders of where we were at in the time that this beer became a thing,
Definitely. There was a time when I was at work and there's a small group of us that are pretty tight, and we're just talking one morning or one day after school or whatever it was, and we were talking about one of our colleagues having a conversation with the superintendent of our school, and someone made reference to our friend being Cuban, and the name, the Cuban and the superintendent, came out. It was mentioned, and I'm like, God, that sounds like a great beer name. I need to do this. I need to figure out how I can do this. Something that you were mentioning earlier kind of triggered that memory a little bit. And so the Cuban and the superintendent came out, and it was I went to Google and kind of looked at the kind of the popular fruits that are available in Cuba, that Cuba is known for. And so I researched it, and I came up with, a lot of tropical, a lot of guava, a lot of pineapple. And if I'm misremembering all of this, someone can email me and tell me.
Correct you, yeah.
But it was this, I really associated all the fruit flavors with of course, with the hops. And I brewed, it was a big double IPA with, I forget the hop schedule now, but it turned out to be a really fantastic beer. And it was all just based on a conversation that we were having and just laughing, and this Cuban and the superintendent came to be.
I love it. If you serve me a beer and you're like, hey, this is the Cuban and the superintendent, first thing I'd be thinking is pickles and mustard because of Cuban sandwiches, right?
Yeah, maybe a little smoke character.
Yeah, some ham or whatever. Yeah. That's anytime Drew Beecham hands me a beer, I'm like, oh God, what is coming my way? That sounds like something he would actually try,
Yes.
So, I love that. Now it's becoming more and more apparent to me, Steve, that you like to get your inspiration from the name and then use that to help kind of guide the way you develop recipes. I love that. I so rarely go about doing it that way.
Sometimes.
Sure, I know it's not, it would never be universal, right?
No, right, correct.
Yeah. So I so rarely do it that way that usually for me, it's like, okay, I want this style of beer on. And I mean, this gets back to recipe design. We've done a whole, experience episode on that as well. But the way I usually start is, what do I want to drink soon? Like, what sounds good to me? Most of the time that's pale lager, I'll admit that. But if I want something else, if I want to try a new hop in an IPA or something, I'll just design a recipe that I almost always, get inspiration from past recipes that I enjoyed for doing that. I'm not one who feels like I have to start fresh with every new recipe, and I'll brew it. And if it comes out good and I like it, then I'll try to think of a name for it. And what I tend to do the most, there's two main things. I already mentioned that I like beer names to have some semblance of meaning for me. And for me, that means a connection with something real that happened. The two of the ways that I do that the most are referencing things from the past or referencing, say, like important figures in my life. A lot of the beer names that I have, people would never even know are actually a reference to somebody in my world. And we're going to talk about some of our favorites here in a minute, so I'll save that. But that to me is a fun way we were talking about kind of paying homage to movies that we like or to music that we like. But for me, it's almost this fun way to keep the people I loved involved in this thing that they're not directly involved in. But, you know, if I'm brewing with a friend of mine, you know, maybe I've brewed many batches where Jersey's around and we end up calling the beer something that, say, has a fighter pilot, reference in it that nobody even notices. And I love doing that as well.
Right. Yeah. I definitely have that in me, and paying homage to certain situations, which I'll get into in a great deal later on. But there's even one that I just, looking at my notes right now, thinking about growing up on the southwest side of Chicago. From an early age, I kind of realized that Miller Lite, as you love, Marshall, was a huge part of what people were drinking when I was growing up. I can remember block parties that I attended either on my block or the block over, and my dad and his friends would all chip in for a keg of Miller Lite. Or just, seeing Miller Lite in the backyard during the summertime and stuff like that. So once I started brewing, I was, trying to think of a way to kind of pay homage to my upbringing. And you would see around here, at least people walking around with T-shirts. It became really popular over the years, where it would be like the people's zip code that is printed on the shirt. So in the southwest side of Chicago, 60629 was the zip code. So I named an American light lager 60629 as a way to kind of remember my childhood, basically. And
love it.
It was just a cool, the beer wasn't that fantastic, I'll admit. I probably used a Kolsch yeast to kind of, cut corners. I couldn't, ferment cold with a traditional lager. But it was still just that nostalgic take on something that it's in part of me. It's in part of probably a lot of other people, definitely people that I grew up with. So it's the way to remember my roots, basically.
I love it, dude. That's what I'm talking about is like knowing that I'm going to make this beer that is going to remind me of, and I've made this reference quite a bit over the years. The smell of a fresh can of Budweiser opening till this day, when I'm close by and somebody cracks open, it's just that beer, which I don't even drink. I'm a Miller Lite guy all the way.
Yes.
But the smell of a Budweiser being cracked open and that, you just get that tiny little whisper of that smell is one of the most nostalgic things for me, because that's what my stepdad drank.
Okay.
And I was at the formative years of my life, we were chaos when I was a kid, but my stepdad was kind of this kind of figure who was fairly stable. Now, I'm not saying by any means that he was stable, but far more so than my mother. And so that there was something about smelling that just, even though through the chaos, it makes me feel good. Like there's something about that smell. And if there's a Budweiser, that red and white can sitting in the ice chest, I'll absolutely grab it and have a sip. It just, again, just for those memories. And so like using a beer name to kind of reference that, and to kind of knowing that you can go back to it whenever you want and make it again.
Exactly.
And have that memory on tap for 3 or 4 weeks, I think is really cool.
And hopefully lager it this time.
Whatever, you do you, man. One other thing before we start talking about beer names and our experiences with specific ones that we've come up with, which is going to be so fun and sentimental. There was one, I went through this phase for a while, probably about 3 years ago with Brewlosophy. I was literally getting sick of coming up with beer names every single week for the recipes that we include in our experiment articles. And the guys were like, just come up with something. I can't, we're brewing too often to name everything.
Right.
But for the website, you got to have something, right? It makes it feel complete. And so I got onto this I challenged myself to come up with a meaningful, and by meaningful, I just mean it had something to do with the recipe or the variable we were testing. That was just one word. And it was so like I would come up with a one word name. And if you go back and you look at a whole bunch of recipes from about 3 years ago, you'll see they're all just one word. And it might be a German word. It might be something that I put into, Google Translate that's Latvian that people had to figure out how to say. And it was really fun for me. It got boring after about a year. I'll admit that. I went back to normal beer names, but it was a fun challenge. And I feel like that's a good way also. If you're kind of writer's block when it comes to brewing, which is like, I don't know what to brew. I'm kind of stuck. I've brewed everything already. Give yourself a challenge where you say, I'm going to name things first and I'm going to stick to this rubric. I'm going to stick to this challenge that I'm giving myself and then go off and brew beers from there. You can come up with some really fun stuff and it can inspire new ways to approach brewing even.
For sure. It actually reminds me of a time when I was going to dinner with my wife. We went to this very popular German restaurant on the Bavarian Lodge. If you ever come up this way, Marshall, we're going for some good German food and even better beer. So we're standing waiting for our table, and there is this sign on the wall, and it had the word Stammich. I'm mispronouncing it, and I'm sorry. But it reminded me of listening to the session from the Brewing Network, and they were talking to somebody, I don't know who it was, some brewer, and he was talking about this whole idea, this whole German tradition of going into a pub or going to a brewery or whatever, and having usually older guys would have a set reservation for a particular table, right? And they would just hang out and they would shoot the shit, play cards, drink beer, whatever, talk. And they would the brewer who was talking to Justin was talking about how occasionally an outsider would come in and they wouldn't realize this whole idea of Stammich that I'm horribly, you know the word that I'm talking about, right?
I know what you're talking about. Okay. I do not know how to pronounce it.
Okay, good. So I'm not the only one. And so the outsider would come in and he would, sit down, and the regulars would kind of come over and kind of remind this patron that, well, we have this set reservation, and as the story goes, if the outsider was cool about it and he moved, he would usually get either brought into the circle and he would be, hang out with them, or they would just buy him a beer, which I think is, a pretty rad thing to do. But that has become the idea for a German beer. More than likely it's going to be a Schwarz beer. So just silly things like that when I'm standing, in a restaurant with my wife thinking about, beer names.
Because that's what nerds like us do.
Yes, exactly. Exactly. My struggle.
Yeah, God, I know it very well, Steve. Well, I thought it'd be fun to close the show out by talking very much more personally about some of the beer names we've come up with. First question that I've got, and I'm going to answer as well, is what was the first beer, if you can recall, Steve, what was the first beer you named and what did you name it? Give us some reasons why you came up with that name.
The first beer was, I have two because it kind of happened simultaneously. Clark's Winter Warmer. For the winter warmer that I brewed. And then also it was a red ale. Both beers, coincidentally, are both beers that I thought were really good when I first brewed them, and now I can never replicate that same beer. And the red ale was called Red-Headed Stepchild and Clark's Winter Warmer. So those are the two.
What was the we heard about Clark's Winter Warmer. What was the driving motivation or inspiration behind Red-Headed Stepchild?
I just think that the phrase itself just kind of made me laugh, and it just kind of stuck. And I would have friends at work who would say, when are you going to brew Red-Headed Stepchild again? So it became kind of a novelty in and of itself, just like Clark's. And this kind of becomes like this bigger than life type of thing, and I have to remind myself it's just beer, but it's like the name kind of overtakes that beer, right? And it kind of becomes more important than just the name or the beer itself.
Yeah, that's what I was talking about with kind of these recipes. Not they're trivial. They're beer recipes. We homebrew. It's not like we're selling our beer, but you give it a name and it becomes this being. It becomes like this thing,
Yes.
you know. And
Yeah.
I love that as well. The first beer that I ever named, I was when I first started brewing, I had a roommate named Nathan, and he and I've told the story a million times where why I bought my first kit. I worked with a guy who came in late and told me it was because he was bottling his beer, and that was the start of me, going to get a homebrew kit. And the first batch we made was this Irish red ale that already had a name. I think it was called like North Corner Irish Red Ale because it came with a kit, and I bought my kit at North Corner Brewing Supply in Bellingham, Washington. Okay. Well, as soon as I made that first extract with Steeping Grains batch, I was hooked, as many people have experienced, and wanted to brew all of these other things. And back then, I wasn't aware, at least, this is 2003, I believe. I wasn't aware of brewing software for recipe design. And so you would hit these servers and look at other recipes people were doing. And then I still have these old, I should share them sometime. I have these old Word documents that just have recipes that I came up with literally like in the month after I started brewing. And my roommate and I, Nathan, did it together. It was one of those bonding things that we had in our small little apartment. It was why we brewed extract back then. And we for whatever reason, started calling ourselves Silver Star. And I don't know why. I don't remember. I remember there being, I was trying to think like what would have influenced that name. And I remember there being this building near where we lived that had like a star on what looked like a chimney. And maybe we were inspired by that as like a locality name type of thing.
Okay.
But the first beer that we ever named was Silver Star IPA, which is funny because I named it before I even brewed it. And then I went on my little hiatus, and that was the very first beer I brewed with my friend Chris here in town. And we made it for a birthday party. And I'm telling you, I've told the story about how I made an IPA that was way more bitter than it was hoppy, and that used to be the thing. By the time I made Silver Star IPA, which we called it that, we had moved past bitterness being cool. It was like, West Coast time,
Yeah.
And we made this beer, and it peeled the enamel off of your teeth. Did we drink the whole keg? You better believe it. But this was what I did is I converted the extract recipe into an all grain recipe. So to correct myself, it was the first all grain beer that we had made together, and I'm telling you, Silver Star IPA felt like getting throwing stars thrown at your tongue is what it felt like because it was so bitter. But that was the very first thing that I named, and the whole inspiration again was what we called ourselves as brewers. We didn't call ourselves like Silver Star Brewery. It was just, let's just call all of our beers Silver Star style. And then it was soon after that where Chris and I, my buddy Chris, who I was brewing with for a few years before he moved out of town, where he really enjoyed the process of coming up with names. So we kind of called ourselves Bright Spot. And the only reason we did that back then was because we would host these events where people could donate money for the beer. So we weren't selling the beer, but we would then donate that money to some cause. We did I think we did an event for Huntington's disease because we had a friend whose mom was going through the really sad, symptoms of the tail end of life with Huntington's disease, and we raised like $1,200 for that.
Nice.
For that, yeah, exactly. So pretty cool stuff there. And but Chris loved to name names, to name the beers stuff that was really neat. And one of the first names that we came up with, and we're going to talk about some of our favorites now. So this is where I'm going to start. This one is available, I believe. It may be on the website. If you can't find it, it's because it's a Patreon recipe. It's called Smiling Sky Pale Ale. And we came up with it as a play on what we called our brewery, our home brewery, which is Bright Spot. And it just this idea that pale ales tend to have this nice orange yellow color. They're great for drinking and being happy on sunny days, which we're very plentiful here in Fresno. And it was this beer that Chris designed as one of his first beers he ever designed fully on his own. And I've told the story back in an experiment episode where we talked about dry hopping at yeast pitch. The very first beer that Chris made was Smiling Sky Pale Ale, where he accidentally added hops at yeast pitch. And that became the way we made that beer after that because it came out so good. And so, again, very little inspiration other than just optimism, I guess. Right. Painful, cringy optimism, some might argue, but we don't care. And that's what we called it. And he ended up making this beautiful label for it. And we still have it out there on the internet somewhere, I'm sure. But that was one of the first meaningful names that I remember. And this was back in 2012, I believe. One of the more meaningful names that we came up with together that has stuck.
Nice. Nice. For me, I have three of them. The one that I'm looking at right now and thinking about kind of pays homage to an old friend who I went to grade school with in high school. It just so happened to coincide with a happy time in my life when the Cubs won the World Series. As a diehard Cub fan, that was some good times. Unfortunately, learning about a friend's death from grade school and high school kind of made me a little humble. And Glory Days was the name of the beer. Of course, if you're a Springsteen fan, you'd recognize the name. But the whole almost serendipitous moment, I guess. I was living in Oak Lawn, Illinois, at the time. I think it was prior to even meeting my wife. This is years and years ago, and I was walking out of Borders Bookshop. It was a neighborhood bookstore by us back then, and he was coming in, and we both kind of locked eyes, and I always regretted not stopping and seeing, if that was actually my friend Jay. And just kind of went about my day and just kind of lived with that regret. And this song Glory Days kind of goes with the lyric. I won't sing it, but I was walking in and he was walking out. In the song, they're walking in and out of a bar, basically. And in the case of the song, the guy goes back in and he sits down and has a beer with them. One of the guys was a really big baseball player. Jay was 3-sport player in high school. Great athlete, incredible quarterback, even better baseball player, damn fine basketball player as well. And so I thought about that moment and just that whole, just brief interlocking of our eyes and seeing if it was him or not. And it looked like him. I wasn't really 100% sure because I never talked to him, unfortunately. But years later, after Jay passed away, I kind of came up with this name. And it was just to pay homage to him and to, I don't know, just kind of remember that life is pretty precious. So
yeah. No, that's beautiful. I love that so much. And then again, and then you get to go back, and every time you brew Glory Days, it's that not only are you paying homage, but it's those memories. And as again, there are going to be people out there who just cannot relate with you and me on this, Steve. But there are some of us, even men, in fact, who are more sensitive and find meaning in this kind of stuff. And
sure.
And I'm with you. I absolutely do as well. My story for the next beer is nowhere near as touching as yours. I'll tell you that.
Sorry to bring the mood down, everyone.
No, God, I love that you shared that story. I think it's beautiful. So there is this beer that Brewlosophy has become known for. It's a recipe that I developed. Must be 9-10 years ago now, that it was an accident. I wanted to build up a slug of yeast at the bottom of a carboy to pitch a double IPA onto, and I'd never used White Labs 090 San Diego super yeast, and so I picked up a vial from my local homebrew shop and I pitched it direct into a relatively low OG. I think it was right around 1050 OG wort. The wort, I thought, you know what, I want to try something I've never tried before. I'm going to reuse this yeast for a double IPA, so I don't need to have a crazy hop bomb on tap. So what I did is I kind of had this idea to do an American English hybrid type of beer or pale ale. And so I used mostly American malts with mostly English hops, fuggles. There was some Perle in there in the middle because at the time I was really big into using the Perle or Northern Brewer in the middle of the kettle at about 30-minute mark because I liked what it did for that kind of mid-level flavor characteristic. I brewed up this beer, fermented it with that single vial of San Diego super yeast. And when it was done, I kegged it and then I immediately pitched the double IPA on top of it, and that fermented like crazy, as you might imagine. Both of those beers were done. Everybody loved the Tiny Bottom Pale Ale. That's what we ended up calling it.
Nice.
And the reason for me coming up with that name, and it's the beer that stuck. That double IPA went down in history. I don't even think I gave it a name. We drank it. It wasn't wonderful, but this weird English American hybrid pale ale that I called Tiny Bottom Pale Ale has become linked to Brewlosophy.
Yep.
I get emails about it weekly still. People asking, where'd you come up with the name? What does it mean? Can I use this hop instead? And my response is usually, you do what you want with it. This is just how I make it.
Exactly.
And every single time I make it, I just heard from somebody last week who brewed it up again. Every time I make it, it is unique and very, very, well, it's unique enough to be drinkable, if that makes sense. And it makes it, and it's just so fun to go back to, and it doesn't taste like any other pale ale I've ever made. Well, the name comes from the fact that my little kid at the time, Roscoe, my son, used to love coming out in the garage and helping me brew. He is an early riser. And back then, in those days, I would do all of my brewing. I'd wake up at 4 o'clock in the morning. This sounds nuts. And I'd go out and brew. Well, he would usually wake up, it would take 45 minutes or so to get your water up to temp. So I'd go start that, come inside, make breakfast, get my coffee ready. Well, he would usually wake up around then as well. Mm-hmm. And so I said, hey, dude, why don't, instead of watching, Sesame Street, why don't you come out and help me out? You can ride your bike, you can do your thing. Well, he brewed with me the entire time, and it felt like one of those moments. I mean, mind you, he was probably 5 at the time, but it felt like one of those moments where, hey, this is so cool. Me and my boy, doing our thing out in the garage. And my wife and I had this joke about him at the time. I've got 2 daughters and a son. My son is the only one who did not inherit my voluptuous lower end. We'll put it that way. And so my wife and I told her as a joke, I said something like, I'm going to call it small ass pale ale or something. She's like, you cannot call a beer small ass. Of course I'm not going to, but she said, why don't you just call it Tiny Bottom? People will have no idea what that means. And so that's what we called it. Tiny Bottom Pale Ale. I'm dead serious. I have local friends, local relatives who come by and they're like, hey, is Tiny Bottom on tap? It's become this thing. It's like this fixture in the world of Marshall's Brewing, and I love it so much. And it all started because my little dude with a small ass came over and helped me brew beer.
Now, I will challenge you. When Roscoe gets married, you better brew that the day of his wedding.
Heaps of it, right?
Yes.
Well, and as an aside, I thought it was funny. I've another weird neurotic thing about me is I'm not a life is fair type of guy. I fully expect to be treated unfairly, quote unquote, and I won't get butthurt by that. But when it comes to my kids, I try to keep things even. And so to pay homage to my kids, my girls who did inherit my lower half, if you will, I did brew an IPA after that we called Badonkadonk IPA, and I thought that was kind of fun.
Nice.
And if you look at that recipe, it's not a pale ale recipe, but it is the same ratios of, I think that's on the website as well. It's the same ratios of malt, just with all American hops to make it more IPA-esque. But that was the tie that kept those together, right? Was that I used the same exact malts in it,
right.
just at higher proportions of it, and made this IPA that ended up being really good as well.
Perfect. And the next one that I have, it was alluded to earlier, and if people follow the Thursday articles, which I'm sure you do, As God is my witness, I thought turkeys could fly, is the next one. I was driving home from the gym one morning, and I was kind of sad that my Märzen was about to kick and I wouldn't have it for Thanksgiving. I always want to have like a Märzen on tap, and maybe a pumpkin ale or something like that during the holidays. And so I had to think of another beer at the time, and I'm still overly obsessed with Amarillo hops. I thought of brewing a fest beer with a lot of Amarillo hops, and so that's what I did. So I had the beer recipe in my mind. It was a very easy recipe, and started thinking about the names. And I don't even know how I came up with as God is my witness, I thought turkeys could fly. But I do remember the WKRP in Cincinnati sitcom that was on in the late 70s, early 80s. And there was a segment of that show where they were doing some promotion for the radio station on Thanksgiving, I believe, and one of the guys, who I forget his name now in the show, but he said, "As God is my witness, I thought turkeys could fly." And then, so fast forward now to, modern day. Abby, my 11-year-old, will remind me, who's an avid, has just this amount of knowledge with animals. Abby reminds me of the fact that turkeys can fly, and I'm like, yes, you're correct, Abby. But at the time, I was referencing a TV show, so there you go. That's how, as God is my witness, I thought turkeys could fly. It's not Thanksgiving in my house without that beer on tap, which it pained me during COVID when we didn't meet for Thanksgiving because of wanting to stay distance and stuff like that. But it was definitely something that's back in full force. So
I love it so much.
I'm happy.
When we published that, the number of people who were like, "Oh my gosh, thank you for the reference."
Yeah.
I completely forgot about that episode. I hadn't even seen it. And I remember when you send me your packages, your article packages and everything for editing, whenever I see the names, I just go straight to Google because I know that there's going to be some rad reference. That's why I was like, where the hell did this name come from?
Yeah.
You know what it reminds me of? There's this band that I love from Seattle, and they actually got pretty big. People have probably heard of them, Minus the Bear. And I think it was their first record where every song name was like this whole sentence. They have a great song called Absinthe Party at the Fly Honey Warehouse.
Nice.
You would never guess the song is it. I don't even know what the reference is there. But yeah, those longer names like that can be really fun when they're done well,
Yeah. My wife always corrects me, says that's too long, and the next beer name will definitely fall into that category of being too long. And my wife will always say, it's too long. No, Steve, you got to rethink that. I'm like, no, it's that's the name. So sometimes I'm a little stubborn, and I will keep something that's rather long because it's what has to be.
That's because that's the name, Steve. You will not be bound by length.
No, never.
One of the longest beer names that I've got that I can think of has a very fun story that I think kind of gives a good idea of how my brain operates when it comes to naming beers. It's called What Are We Here For? Cal Common. It's a California common beer. It was this was one of those ones that I love. Cal Common, probably top 5 favorite styles, right? Really kind of borders on that lagery characteristic, just crisp, drinkable, but has a whole bunch of malt character. I love Northern Brewer. So I had been working, some local brewer friends of mine, we all kind of got on this Cal Common kick, probably about 10 years ago or so. And we were all kind of iterating over and over and over again. And this is one where I had like Cal Common 1, Cal Common 2. And in the notes, it'd be like, try this next time. Well, I landed on this recipe where I was like, yes, it actually, I think it scored like a 43 at NHC 2014 or something like that. I mean, it did really well in competitions, just a phenomenal beer. And I ended up calling it What Are We Here For? And watch, I'm going to help you figure out why I called it that. What is another name for California Common?
A steam beer.
A steam beer. And Anchor who made it. Anchor Brewing out of San Francisco is what made steam beer popular. So
right.
What happens when, you go to a drive-in movie in a cooler climate like up in the Seattle area and you're with your girlfriend with the windows up and you start, as the older folks like to say, you start necking a little bit.
Yes.
What happens to the inside of the car?
They get a little steamy.
You steam up the windows a little bit. And so there was this one time and she's my wife now. We were late teenagers and we drove out to Auburn, Washington, where they had I think it's Auburn, where they had a drive-in movie still. We go for the double feature and we're sitting there and we start to see cars and we weren't doing anything. We're being wholesome. Don't get me wrong, but we're doing our thing, like teenagers do. And we start to see car lights leaving. And next thing you know, there's a knock on the window and it is completely fogged over these windows. And I roll down the window and the lady's like, "Hey, the movies are over." We're like, "Oh, it wasn't a double feature. It was just one movie. We thought there was going to be 2."
Okay.
So it wasn't late or anything.
Okay.
And I look over and Laura's like, my wife's name's Laura. She's like, what are we here for? I forgot what movie we came to see. So that is one of my favorite names. We call it What Are We Here For California Common, in reference to the fact that it is a steam beer, which you know, that is only Anchor can call their steam beer apparently. And so that is, that's one of my favorite names personally.
That is awesome. That's a great story. That's a great story. So the timing of this podcast kind of coincides with both worldly events that are taking place right now, and in the beer world locally. There is a great brewery that I reference a lot. My friends Amanda and Brandon Wright own Workforce Brewing. And Workforce came out with a beer a few years ago when Vladimir Putin was deciding to do his horrific deeds, and Brandon came up with a beer. It was an Imperial Stout called Putin is a Douche.
Yes.
Just recently, as a matter of fact, just yesterday, Brandon and Amanda just released their second iteration of Putin is a Douche. I have 2 bottles of it waiting for me in my beer fridge in my garage right now. And so this was the creative pulse behind my big Imperial Stout, which I brewed with my homebrew club about 5 years ago. Is a big brew day gathering at a local brewery called Hopvine. My friend Ken McMullen was nice enough to host, and he brewed up a wort, which was a simple wort, like 1050 or so OG, and he gave it to everybody who was wanting to brew the beer. So I didn't want to just brew a simple, pale ale or IPA or anything like that. I wanted to make it big. And so I decided to do a reiterated mash. So basically I've taken the wort that Ken graciously gave us, and then I added another 10 to 12 pounds of grain, and then steeped that in and came up with this really big, almost 12% Imperial Stout. And this stout won at my homebrew club, so therefore it was, as the prize was, I got to brew it commercially with Ken at Hopvine, so it was on tap there for a good long while. You can look it up on Untapped. The name of the beer is 50 Shades of Gorbachev's Birthmark. So, as kind of going back to Putin is a douche, that was the motivation behind it. I didn't want to do something with Putin because of the fact that, and this kind of still holds true for me with naming beers, I don't want to just kind of glom onto someone else's idea of creative ideas. I wanted to think of something of my own. So I kind of forced myself to be a little bit more creative. So Putin was definitely out of the mix. And then this image of Gorbachev, being a kid of the 80s, you kind of have that image of him and that birthmark that he had on his forehead. And I just thought of wow, that has to be something with the beer name. So I had that portion of it, down. And then, ironically enough, at the time, my wife was reading the book 50 Shades of Grey. She kind of dismissed it before and just thought, it's not for me. I'm not interested. But then, for whatever reason, people talking about it at work or whatever, friends were talking about it, I don't even know. Then she started reading the book herself. And while I thought, 50 Shades of Gorbachev's Birthmark, that kind of has a catchy ring to it. So that became the Imperial Stout that I brewed. And I did a couple of different reiterations of that beer with different names, but basically the same basic ingredients, just I didn't do the reiterated mash. So the basic style and the ingredients were pretty much the same, just a different approach to it, different process. And that beer actually won several awards over time, and some of it was barrel aged, and really good beer. So that was the one that I was just texting it back and forth with a buddy of mine yesterday when I was going to pick up bottles of Putin as a douche. And he reminded me of that. And he was like, didn't you come up with something? I'm like, yeah, 50 Shades of Gorbachev's birthmark. So
I honestly, Steve, wasn't going to tell the story about how 50 Shades of Grey is your favorite book, and that's what inspired the name for that. But we'll leave that alone. You know what's funny is and we're going to wrap up here. But I was reminded when you were talking about that Imperial Stout of the way I was introduced to Brewlosophy contributor Phil Rusher was that he emailed me and said, hey, I've got some beers I want Jersey and Tim to review. And I gave him my address and he sent them out. And one of them was a Russian Imperial Stout that he brewed for his wedding. Now, Phil's last name is Rusher. And so, I mean, if ever there was a better name for a Russian Imperial Stout that you serve at your wedding, this beer was called From Russia with Love. Yes. And I mean, what an incredible opportunity for a beer name. And you look at just how I would never have even thought about that, but it is so literal that it doesn't feel literal, and it works because of the style. It's the best, right? From Russia with Love.
I just referenced that beer name with my wife a few weeks ago, and we both just laughed because
it's amazing.
He just nailed it.
The fact that it was at his wedding, I love it.
Incredible.
Yeah, incredible. Well, Steve, that is all the time we've got for this episode. Do you have any final words on your experience when it comes to naming beers?
Name your beers. Have fun with it. If you're not into it, that's cool. Pale Ale 1, Pale Ale 2 is cool too. I have this certain love for words and language, pop culture, things that just make you think, I guess, memories. And it comes out in my brewing, and it is a fun way to be creative. So name your beers, and if you have any, you're stuck on something, email me, steve@brewlosophy.com, and I will do my best to try to help you out.
Yeah, I love it. And if you have any rad beer names or ways that you go about naming your beers, reach out to us, feedback@brewlosophy.com. We love reading about stuff like that, and we'll share it on the show as well. Well, don't forget to check out our podcast, The Brew Lab, where host Cade Job takes you into the lab with real brewing experts to discuss fascinating research they've done on our favorite beverage. And remember to head over to brewlosophy.com to stay current on everything we're up to. The Brewlosophy podcast is made possible by the generous support of our sponsors, as well as all of our rad listeners. We seriously could not do this without you. Cheers to everyone who has subscribed and left a review of our show. It makes a huge difference. If you haven't yet, please consider doing so. Head over to brewlosophy.com/support to view a list of ways you can easily help us to continue producing this podcast. If you want a reward for your support, visit patreon.com/brewlosophy. Thanks again for listening. We'll be back next week with another episode of the Brewlosophy podcast. Until then, think beer.
Start off the morning with some hot tea, lemon and honey, cause it suits my bro. Put some herb in the bowl, yeah, it's homegrown. Ain't gotta go through the middleman, no